Hi, everybody, and welcome to panel 9 on climate change, the gateway to a new form of diplomacy. I'm really excited about this panel that we have for you here today, because over the last 2 days, you've heard a little bit about the challenges that we're facing in terms of climate change and adapting to that, and what are some of the issues that we're facing around that. Then yesterday you heard about some of these solutions, and here we're looking obviously at projects at a European or even global level that are providing some of these good solutions to some of these challenges that we face. Then today we're looking at the idea of the artist, the scientist, and the politician. So in principle, maybe the three of those don't make a lot of sense together. But I would also add to that the Vatican. So this is 3 or 4 different aspects that maybe don't have a lot in common, but our main common denominator is climate change. And this is something that that at a global level is maybe something we're struggling to deal with correctly. Indeed, on the current global geopolitical tensions that we are seeing, we are needing now more than ever strong diplomacy in order to deal with some of these aspects that we are seeing. Where previously we were seeing no particular controversies with regards to the Geneva Convention, but now we are seeing a complete blatant disregard for that as we see these different wars taking place across the globe. Climate change is another war that we are dealing with right now, and one where we need strong diplomacy to cope with. So with that, we are looking here today on how that diplomacy can indeed be a gateway to deal with some of these tensions that we are seeing. We have a really distinguished panel for you, and I'll introduce each one of them to you now. And then once I've introduced them, we'll go through their videos. So they'll give you a bit of an outline of where they currently are, some of their own opinions with regards to the idea of diplomacy within this space. And then we have a set of questions where we will debate together with them and see exactly their different points of views on how they see this current diplomacy and what we can do in order to improve diplomacy in terms of climate change. If you have any questions, you can ask them within the link that you have, and then I'll be able to pick them up here, and we can ask the panel those questions. So with that, I would just like to introduce each one of the panel members to you, so that we have a better idea of who we are dealing with. First, we have TEBALDO VINCIGUERRA. He's a PhD candidate at the Department of Law, Economics, and Politics at the University of Rome. He graduated in 2007 in political science and international studies at the Faculty of Political Science of Turin. He is currently enrolled in a PhD program in economics, and he's working on water-related issues as a researcher on natural disasters at the Italian Ministry of Defense from 2008 to 2009. And he's also the coordinator of the Manchay Verde project of the Arco di Sense in Lima, in Peru, from 2009 to 2010. But since 2011, he's been working on environmental issues at the service of the Holy See. Additionally to that, he is married to Diane, and they have 4 children together. So I think with TEBALDO, we're going to have a very interesting discussion on exactly what is the view from the Vatican in terms of climate change and some of the diplomacy aspects around that. Second on my list is Dr. Johan Shah. We've had the pleasure of being in a panel on the Cassandra Conference already last year. But Johan is the Associate Senior Fellow at the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, and he's the Vice Chair of the Expert Group for Aid Studies under the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. At Swedish SIDA, he has led the Department for Climate Change and Environment and the humanitarian unit, respectively. He holds a PhD from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, and he has working experience from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So his perspective on these geopolitical tensions is going to be very, very interesting. Then we have Diego Osario. Diego is currently based in Canada, so thank you for joining us there, Diego. And he's about to make his way back to Harvard University, where he's a fellow at the Weatherhead Scholars Program at the Center of International Affairs. He's a very experienced professional in the public, administrative, and international relations. He has held senior positions at SICAR and the global affairs in Canada. He's currently focusing on climate change, conflict, and adaptation policies. His experience spans very different roles, specifically at UN, at NATO, and at the World Bank, in the private sector initiatives, as well as academic pursuits. And as a PhD candidate at Utrecht University, he has a really great perspective on public, private, and academia side. So we're going to have a real interesting debate with Diego. Finally, Dr. Susanne Schmier is joining us from IHE Delft at the Institute of Water Education. She's an associate professor in water law and diplomacy, and she's the head of water governance department at IHE Delft. Her research and advisory work focuses on the linkages between environmental and water challenges, between the conflict and cooperation, with particular interest in legal and institutional mechanisms for conflict prevention. She also advises various governments and international organizations on related topics. And she has worked for the GIZ and the World Bank and the Mekong River Commission, amongst other institutions. So as you can see, we've been very lucky to have this panel sit in front of us, very distinguished, and they will now have their videos played for you, so you can see exactly their perspective, their ideas. And after the video presentations, come back to me, and then we will be able to have a few questions and debate around this topic.
This approach can provide the foundation for informed decision-making. It offers insight into the complex issues we face and provide us with the tools to find solutions and sustainable solutions. Art, on the other hand, has the unique ability to touch hearts and minds, transcending language and cultural barriers. It can inspire empathy, ignite passion, and create a shared sense of purpose. Through artistic expression, we can communicate the urgency of global challenges and mobilize communities toward collective action. Together, science and art can bridge the gap between nations, fostering understanding and cooperation. They can ignite a spark of creativity and innovation that transcend borders, leading to groundbreaking discoveries and transformative solutions. Scientists and artists with their brilliant mind could be the architect of bridges that we could not construct. By embracing the alliance between science and art, we can unlock the full potential of diplomacy, which is now, and by this turbulent world, in crisis. We can build bridges of understanding, empathy, and collaboration that transcend political differences and conflict, and ensure a peaceful world. Scientists and artists, diplomats and innovators must come together to forge a new era of diplomacy. Let us harness the power of science and art to unite nations and to tackle the global challenges to create a better world for all. Together, we can make a difference.
Buongiorno from Rome. Many thanks for having me as a speaker. Climate change is often described as a shark. Almost all its jaws are made of water. Dry seasons, floods, irregular rain, sea level rise, and so on. We know the consequences. This is crisis. Often good decisions and improvements have blossomed from a painful crisis. For example, new lifestyles and institutions. Facing such daunting challenges requires unity. We have to do something in common, and water resources and even the atmosphere are often called common goods. From a Department of Economics perspective, a common good or commons is a pool of resources from which no one can be excluded, but its consumption is rival. Therefore, congestions and even destruction are possible. This approach considers alternatives, rates of recharge, quantity, and collaboration. Now, according to many lawyers and activists, water as a common good means that it is vital, that it should be accessible for all and, as far as possible, managed by all, protected from privatization. This approach considers rights, priorities, and ownership. For the sake of efficiency, we should avoid a bubble effect and reconcile the two approaches. The ongoing crisis spares no discipline and no continent. In a time of threats and uncertainty, the exhortation Laudate Deum of Pope Francis deserves attention. The old diplomacy is in crisis. We need to reshape multilateralism with new procedures for decision-making, spaces for conversation, arbitration, and conflict resolution, a sort of democratization of the global context, a multilateralism from below, in which citizens control political power. On the other hand, we need effective world organization with real authority. Challenging, isn't it? The water part of the 2030 agenda and of climate action can be the gateway, the motivation, a very meaningful and consensual starting point for development and peace. No time to lose. Thank you.
Does climate change offer the gateway to a new kind of diplomacy that could help us address a range of challenges that we face today, such as the biodiversity crisis, the health crisis, and so on? Would and could science or culture offer tools, diplomatic tools that would help us? I think we first of all need to take a good look at the diplomatic process already in place. We have been negotiating how to resolve the climate challenge since 1995, when the first conference of the parties to the Climate Convention was held in Berlin. The agenda of those negotiations has become increasingly complicated. More and more dimensions of climate change have been added. The negotiation teams from states that participate have grown larger and larger, from the climatologists and environmentalists to now include economy, social sciences, political science, technology, and so on and so forth, and not least the sort of traditional diplomacy that's represented by our ministries of foreign affairs. So the process is in place, and it's unique in being underpinned by science. Negotiations are based very much on the assessments that are produced on a regular basis by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we already have this process, and still we are not making the kind of progress that we must make. We experience on an almost daily basis how the impacts in terms of extreme weather and so on and so forth is becoming increasingly complex and tangible. So why is it that we are not making progress? Is it because of powerful financial interests that stand in the way in the form of the oil industry? Is it because of a populist climate denial agenda? Or do we simply lack the tools, the diplomatic tools that are necessary to make real progress and really ensure that we can solve these tremendous problems that we are facing? I look forward to discuss that today.
Many of the challenges that the international community is faced with today are both transboundary in nature, that is, they cannot be addressed, let alone solved, through unilateral action within states, and of high scientific complexity. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and transboundary water management are prominent examples of those. Transboundary water resources, for example, which are water resources that are shared between states, account for more than 60% of all global freshwater flows. 50% of the world's population live in basins that are shared by 2 or more countries, and in total, more than 300 transboundary surface water basins and more than 300 transboundary aquifers span the various parts of our planet. The management of water resources, especially in times of a changing climate, is of high scientific and technical complexity. Our understanding of how different water uses will affect ecosystems and the people depending on them are often still limited, and assessing whether, for example, a dam project in one country causes harm on another country requires the technical expertise of many different disciplines. Likewise, forecasting the impacts of climate change on rain and snowfall, and thus on the water availability for people to produce food and energy today and in the near and far future, is based on complex scientific models and processes. But science is not only necessary to understand the complexity of natural, but also human and societal systems. Science has also proven to be an important tool of diplomacy, in the form of science diplomacy itself, but also as a part of issue-specific diplomacies, such as water or climate diplomacy. Science can often transcend national, cultural, or religious boundaries when formal diplomatic relations can't. Scientists can collaborate and form networks that foster cooperation between countries. These can, as the example of the development of the agreement on the Guarani aquifer shows, later lead to formal water agreements between countries. Scientists can also contribute to diplomatic processes, as the example of the recent negotiations of a treaty and the creation of a basin organization in the Southern African Buzi-Pungwe-Save Basin shows, which was inspired and informed by researchers from the Southern African region and around the globe. And research networks such as the Commission for the Hydrology of the Rhine or the International Association for Danube Research provide important inputs to intergovernmental negotiation and cooperation processes, such as in the context of the Rhine and the Danube countries, which formally agreed to collaborate on climate change adaptation in these basins on the basis of scientific evidence. But we also have to acknowledge, in today's world, science is being ridiculed and facts are being declared as fake news. Such increasing disregard for science does not only undermine the very basis of knowledge that we need to address today's challenges, most of which, whether pandemics or climate change, biodiversity loss or food price crisis, transcend the boundaries of nation states. The disregard for science also comes with the risk of burning some of the last bridges we still have across an increasingly divided and unilateral world.
As you can see from these videos, we have a very awesome perspective on each one in terms of where we see diplomacy at the moment and some of the challenges that we've seen around that. And with the last video that we saw from Susanne, I'd like to come directly to you. You spoke a lot about science, the diplomacy. You spoke a lot about the idea of transboundary cooperation. But we can see right now, with regards to the current geopolitical tensions, in contradiction to the Geneva Convention, water is currently being used as a weapon in current global wars. We're seeing this right now between Israel and Gaza, and we can see indeed that water, as you had mentioned in some of your examples, it can potentially be used as a vehicle for peace. So I'd like to just delve a little bit deeper into where you think good diplomacy with regards to water has created this vehicle for peace.
Thanks, David. I think maybe starting, I think we need to differentiate between water being used as a weapon or water also becoming a casualty in armed conflict, and water being a source or a stress multiplier in conflict, which are two quite different things. And indeed, we are also seeing water being a source of conflict or water contributing to conflict, like we've seen in Sudan, we've seen in the Niger Delta, where farmer and herder groups, for example, but sometimes also countries compete over water resources that are indeed, or that they perceive to be scarce. But as you say, there's also a lot of examples that we typically don't talk so much about, where water has actually been a source of peace. In fact, if we look at empirical research, there are many, many, many more examples where water is a source of peace than where water is a source of conflict. It's just that they typically don't make it into the news. So I'm thinking of one example, quite famous one, is if you look to southeastern Europe, the Sava River Basin, which is former Yugoslavia. After the wars in the 1990s there, countries of former Yugoslavia that had been enemies in the war, that had been fighting each other, came together after the peace agreement to identify which issue they would work on together first. And of course, relations were very tense. It was very difficult to find an issue that they would want to cooperate on at all. And it wasn't trade, it wasn't transport, it wasn't anything else. It was water that they picked as the starting point for cooperation. And I think that's really interesting, because it really shows how water, even if countries have different interests, can be a starting point, because it just can only be managed in a cooperative manner. Another example, I think, is if you look to Southern Africa, is the Southern African Development Community. When the SADC Treaty was drafted, again, there, countries had to decide which issues to cooperate on. And the first one they picked to develop a legally binding protocol on was also water. And today that ensures that the countries in South Africa, in spite of the region being extremely water scarce in most places, being highly hit by climate change, is still a region where cooperation by far prevails over conflict. So if we look worldwide, I think there's actually a lot of good examples that we can find, we should also talk about and disseminate, where water is a source of peace and cooperation instead of conflict.
Yeah, thanks, Susanne. I think you're totally 100% correct there. I mean, good news doesn't make it to the front pages, right? And I think right now we need good news. We need to hear these examples of how these cooperation agreements have actually made a difference. Johan, maybe I'd like to come to you, actually, working at the International Peace Research Institute. I think there's potential some examples of these good news stories that maybe you have as well with regards to diplomacy and international cooperation and agreements that maybe you've seen in the past.
Good morning. I'm also, like Diego, I'm also in the Western Hemisphere. So two of us have a very early start. I'm just outside Philadelphia. Good to be with you. So, of course, there's no abundance of good stories or sort of promising news that we can talk about from a CIPRI perspective at this moment. Certainly we can find them, and I could mention one or two perhaps, but just to give a kind of setting of our work, CIPRI started out in 1969 as an organization created by the Swedish government to address, and of course this was at the peak of nuclear armament, and this was an effort to contribute to ways of reducing military spending, engaging disarmament and so on, which has to be a collaborative, a transboundary, a multilateral effort. And of course, one very sort of simple, basic observation one can make is that at this moment, we have quite a dramatic increase in military spending. And of course, when that happens, it also means that less resources are being allocated for the kinds of challenges that we are talking about today. Also, less attention is spent on addressing these kinds of problems. And I would say that one thing we have learned is that it is the countries who find themselves in high tension or in conflict that give the least attention to climate change, the impacts of climate change, to eroding biodiversity and so on and so forth. And of course, this means that one cannot address these kinds of problems if you do not have an element of stability where you can make the analysis, you can make your investments, you can engage your public and so on. On this score, CIPRI last year launched the report Environment of Peace, which was a major research effort, and there's a report that people can look at if you're interested, basically stating that there is this link between degrading, or a link between insecurity and environmental degradation. And there's also the reverse link, that when you have environmental degradation, that it can contribute to insecurity. So you need to sort of have the two perspectives of peace building and addressing environmental problems at the same time. They have to be integrated. Beginning with armaments and disarmament, CIPRI has obviously branched into other areas of activity, one being more specifically climate change and security. So CIPRI contributed when climate change became an issue at the level of the UN Security Council, being increasingly discussed. Sweden, supported technically by CIPRI, helped create the Climate Security Mechanism, which is an entity at the UN Secretariat in New York, a sort of collaborative effort between UNDP and UNDPPA. And now being in a place to advise government on the potential linkages, the risks that come with climate change impacts, particularly in countries in conflict. And this has led to, this concern from the Security Council has led to a number of UN missions now, political missions in countries in conflict, also being tasked to analyze, to assess the risks that emerge from the impacts of climate change and how that can impact the conflictual situation. In my case, I have worked particularly over the past few years on these linkages in the Middle East. So in the region of the Middle East and North Africa, and more specifically in a few countries. And of course, like Susanne is saying, a building block, a foundation has to be, as these problems are indeed transboundary, you have to have an element of sort of shared analysis, shared understanding, and shared ability to address these transboundary problems. And of course, the difficulty in the Middle East and North Africa is that we have very few such transboundary agreements on water. So for that region, this is indeed a key challenge, a key task to, particularly as we see the impacts of climate change on access to and availability of water. The sort of joint effort to address this in a transboundary and regional manner is a very important task. Just one sort of positive or promising thing one could mention is that work that the CIPRI has done with the World Food Programme over a number of years, looking at to what extent the design of food security interventions can be done in such a way that it actually reduces tensions and contributes to stability, particularly at the local level in countries in conflict. And there's some quite promising examples of how you can very deliberately shape and design your food security interventions in such a way that communities come together and find ways of resolving problems in a collaborative fashion. So there are some examples, but I think the overall we need to be optimistic, but the sort of global perspective is pretty bleak at the moment, as I think we can agree.
Yeah, certainly do agree with that, Johan. But I think these positive examples are some way of looking a little bit with the glass half full. If at any point any panel member wants to jump in, please just jump in. I'm going to ask each one of you individually with regards to your own ideas and your own perspectives. But if at any point one of the other panel members mentions something and you would like to add to that or contradict it or whatever it may be, no problem. Just jump in and then we can have a discussion. So we've got plenty of time and we can go through that. With that, actually, Diego, we haven't heard from you yet, so I'd like to come directly to you. Actually, there's and I think the discussion that we're having around what Suzanne was mentioning and Johan then followed up on, we're looking at this idea of sort of global security, and you've had a previous role in NATO and obviously advising also for the Canadian government. What role do you think international organizations have in creating sort of a diplomatic landscape, should we say, with regards to climate change? And just to follow up a little bit on what Johan and Suzanne were saying. So just from your own perspective, your role that you've had in NATO and how you see this diplomacy within climate change currently being shaped.
Yeah, well, thank you very much to all of you, and very glad to be part of this panel. You asked me a question about institutions, international institutions, and I will have to say that if I can just take a kind of umbrella concept, the institutional framework at the international level that deals with the management of this global crisis, climate change, and the different variants, climate change and the energy transition, climate change and the emissions control, and climate change and the security issue, and many others, climate change and food security, it's not really up to the task. The institutional framework is short in terms of the capacity to deliver the solutions at the speed that are needed. That's perhaps a factor of how these institutions are being created. I mean, diplomacy doesn't do things quickly, right? And perhaps time is not helping on this particular one. Also because by design, they are not necessarily encompassing the plurality of voices that we need to be able to ensure that they are at the table. We have an institutional framework that is quite focused on the states, member countries of the United Nations, or if you take a COP, whoever gets to negotiate the treaty happens to be the group of diplomats that are representing the countries. But civil society and international organizations that are linked to the non-governmental framework, they are not necessarily involved at that level. There are processes of consultation. There's certainly a desire to create mechanisms, but they're not exactly at this point including those. So if I want just to make an example, there is one international organization, the ILO, in which you have more than just the diplomats of the country. You have representatives of all different factors. So you have a kind of a triangle, employers, employees, and the government. And that is the representation that goes to Geneva to talk about issues related to labor. Something like that. Something that is a little bit more inclusive, something that is a little bit more spread, something that represents the plurality of voices that need to be at the table has to be put in there. Because one of the things with climate change is that it's something, and I have mentioned this before, so for those who have heard me say it before, I do repeat myself on this, climate change is cognitively diffuse. It's not something that captures the sense of imperiousness and the imperative that comes out of a natural emergency. It's not an asteroid that's going to hit us in a year or something like that. It's something that's happened little by little. And because of that, we don't get the kind of pressing emergency, the sense of inevitability that we need to have so that there is a massive mobilization. If we don't have the consensus at the social level, we don't have the pressure at the political level, we don't have that translated into the pressure that makes our political leaders take the appropriate action. And if they want to take the appropriate action, they don't have the political backup because there are other priorities that get in the way. That happens in this country, happens in many others. You're going to worry about climate change, or you're going to worry about inflation? You're going to worry about climate change or the housing crisis that you have to deal with? So this is a little bit of a problematic issue. So I think, in a way, we have the most fundamental crisis humanity has ever experienced, and it's right there. For me, climate change is an issue of governance because it's how we have a system that allows us to work together, coordinate, and get this stuff done. This is an interesting thing. Humanity is at risk, and yet it's not something for which we need new science or a salvation or a hero. We have everything we need. We have all the knowledge. We have all the capacities, yet we don't manage to have a structured response to address this issue in the time, the speed, and the scale that is needed. And on that, I would just conclude by actually making a reference to the Vatican, because when I was working for the CGRI, we reach out to the Vatican as well. And there is one phrase that stuck with me, which was, I was talking to somebody from, I think, the same Vicariat as TEBALDO, and this whole idea that to bring change, you need to influence 25 to 30% of the population. Once you have that factor, you have a multiplying effect. And, you know, if somebody knows about how to influence people, the Vatican's really are on the money. And that is something that is a key element in the design of a governance system. We need to be able to create a governance system that creates representation, scalability, speed of action, and implementation in a way that we can activate that 25% and hope that that is going to have the cascade effect so that the rest of the population follows through. Because as it stands now, and clearly, and I will finish with this, we have many priorities, we have many crises, but we need to make sure that this one goes through, because unfortunately, beyond the Ukraine conflict and the many other humanitarian crises, this one is of a scale that we have not yet really seized. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Very interesting perspectives, and I totally agree with this idea of how climate change is currently being seen, about this slow change and this crisis that essentially we are living. But when we start to talk about a 1.5 degree change or 2 degree change, majority of people, and I include myself in this, we cannot conceptualize what that really means. In terms of a 1.5 degree change, people think, well, I'll go from 20 degrees to 21.5 degrees. That seems warmer. That's all right for me. You're right. And this is the concept we have in mind, because we struggle as a species to have an understanding of this change over a longer period of time. And so this is where we maybe need to change a little bit the discourse and to see a way of explaining what this actually means in a different way. Because if we're looking at this idea of a small change like that having a massive global influence, then we need to show exactly what that means. One of the ways that you said that we can look at this is having a look at the plurality of voices, so the different perspectives coming into that. And you actually then mentioned this idea of moving a lot of people, and I think this brings us nicely into TEBALDO, where you can speak to us a little bit about the role that the Vatican has within this. And I actually did take the time to read some of the publications on the Holy See, and to my surprise, I saw a lot of talk and a lot of publication on climate change, what that means for the population as a whole. And before Johan was speaking about climate deniers, and so I was wondering what role you see the Vatican taking with regards to a large section of the population that is still climate deniers. Clearly, from the publications that we see on the Holy See, there's the Vatican does see this idea of climate change as something that is affecting us globally, and clearly using science behind that. So Suzanne was mentioning before how science needs to be a vehicle that crosses many boundaries and many languages. So perhaps you can speak to us a little bit around the role that the Vatican has, how it can move, the number of people it can move, and its vision on climate change that it currently has.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me correctly. So delighted to be with you. Thank you very, very much for those questions and for the previous comments. Indeed, I'm today here representing LUMSA University, but also as a scholar, you can also comment, obviously, on the Vatican documents and Vatican initiatives. I'm here based today in UNESCO Paris, and it has been recognized that SDGs is not out of track. SDG 6 is alarmingly out of track. This was one of the strong messages we heard in the last 2 days here. UNESCO also recognized well-known Spanish tribunals dealing with water issues. These are courts established centuries ago, which deal with conflict or tensions related to irrigation. So the simple fact that many groups, many actors agree to have a common institution, this highlights the necessity for the rule of law, governance, but also law and implementation. And you started this discussion quoting the Geneva Conventions. So these were certainly a great achievement of European countries wounded by war. More than 1 century ago, Catherine Coman studied water rights in the west of the United States of America. She published on top economic journal. Catherine Coman maybe is the first scholar working on commons, water managed in common. And almost 1 century after, we have Elinor Ostrom, maybe more famous. She received the Nobel Prize precisely for working on the commons. And in her essays, she analyzed several examples from the field of irrigation. A first comment, at least for the moment, at the beginning and at the end of the theory of the commons, we have 2 women, economists, women maybe having a specific vision. Maybe we also need more of that vision in management, in governance, in diplomacy, and in economics. Ostrom proposed a set of rules for governing commons, such as really understanding what is a pool of resources, a river, a lake, a spring, that we have clear implementation, that we have a clear way of punishing who is not doing as expected, and also that the local level of governance should be recognized by the higher level, maybe the national or the regional level. Many scholars say, beautiful, this won't work for 2 reasons. Well, this won't work at the global level or higher level for 2 reasons. The first one, it is hard to define a very big pool of resources. Maybe the entire Danube River, or the entire Congo Basin, or the entire ocean, or the entire atmosphere. It is hard to conceptualize it as a pool of resources. Then why should we have governance if it is not really a pool of resources, but only something we are ruining through externalities? And the second question often is, well, there is a strong distance between water and the governance level. It is not really people on the spot, grassroots organizations. Here there is clearly something we should address. If water is so important, as we know, as also Susanne Schmeier highlighted, we have to do something in order to manage it in common. Maybe beyond those powerful financial interests mentioned by Johann Schaar, we also have some people who are not denial, but maybe with some cynicism or pragmatism cynicism, say, I can cope.
I can plant trees in my garden, I can build walls around my garden, and I may be able to survive climate change. And who cares about all the others? So here, clearly, climate change and water-related issues in both adaptation and mitigation become an issue of social justice. Science goes beyond borders, of course, and this is a leitmotif of UNESCO: science for peace, science for sustainable development, and science and education, of course. However, often science cannot provide the answer to the following question: why should I care? Science can explain you the causes of a given situation and what may happen if you do this, if you do that, or if you do nothing. But why should I care? It's not easy. It goes certainly to individual conversion, to behavioral change, to education, and to education, but together, acting together, as the previous speaker said, no? Doing together, deciding together, and certainly water can be a major starting point. So united through water, united for water. And recently, Pope Francis, so for the first time, a Pope will attend a COP on climate change. So he announced his participation in the Dubai gathering. He released a strong letter, a strong exhortation, including several paragraphs, very strong in scientific language and in scientific data, really showing that a given facts about climate change are happening and have and will have clear, strong impacts on our lives. And frankly, we know this is not only for the usual poor areas of the world. Even OECD countries know very well that climate change bites and bites hard. The final part of the exhortation, it's called Laudate Deum, insists on two items. One certainly is better governance, so a new way of diplomacy. On the one hand, having strong institutions. This means that the governance, let's say at global level, at UN level, for a number of very important objectives should have real authority. So not only recommendation or non-binding. So this is strong stance in favor of effective multilateral governance. But also the Pope insists on a multilateralism from below, in which, and this has been also been highlighted, local communities, citizens, activists can have real accountability on behalf of government. And the second point is the motivation that stems from spirituality, from genuine values. Why should I care for water? Why should I care for the others? Maybe facing a very strong threat, so water-related challenges and climate change and peace and livelihoods and health, etc., we can accelerate the transition to a healthy governance rooted on good values. We really are facing a crisis. Either we learn something of the crisis, either we don't learn something from the crisis. And thank you for all your inspiring comments.
Thank you very much, TEBALDO. I think that that intervention is very very astute and also very interesting. I mean, specifically, and like I mentioned, I did actually read through some of the comments and statements from Pope Francis, and as you mentioned, they are rooted in science, which I think is quite a departure, should we say, from more conservative approaches. So I think this is definitely seeing some change in a massive institution. And I think that type of change is something that we still lack at government levels, at higher levels of government, where we still see some climate deniers at the highest level of governance. And I think that this is probably somewhere that we can certainly want that change, but how do we start to create that change? So, Suzanne, I would like to come to you. You're a major supporter of science, and this came through in your video presentation. And TEBALDO actually mentioned that one of the aspects that science can't answer is, why should I care? Then I'd like to see, from your point of view, obviously the population are the ones that vote for the government and are the ones that then have the chance to change the government in terms of those that are current climate deniers to those that are looking at putting in some strong diplomacy on climate action. So just from your point of view, what role does science play within the greater population in intentionally why should the population care?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I agree entirely with you, TEBALDO, on science can't answer the question why we shouldn't care. I mean, there's a lot of interesting behavioral science out there, psychology and other disciplines, neuroscience, looking into why people care about something, why people change their behavior or not, including in the field of climate or water. There's, for example, an interesting study done in Europe that looks into how long people actually remember catastrophic events such as floods that affected themselves, and how long they're willing to take measures like changing their preparedness, changing flood measures for their house, and what's the point where they go back to normal. So I think there's interesting research that we're probably not harvesting enough yet. But generally, on the other hand, probably I should say, I do see a tendency where science is maybe playing a smaller role, and we're losing a bit the connection between science and policy and science and the general public, and where science is often disregarded as fake news, as something that are facts that you believe in or that you don't believe in. And I think, yeah, there are probably a number of reasons for that, and therefore also a number of things that we can potentially do. I think as scientists, there is definitely a need to communicate things better, to be more transparent, to also be more honest about what we know and what we don't know, and at the same time emphasize that even if we don't know everything, which we'll never know in science, there can still be a need and in fact an urgency to act. I mean, we've seen this also with the COVID crisis. Policymakers, but also the public, was expecting scientists, virologists, and so on to know everything. And when they didn't, basically their entire advice was sometimes disregarded. And I think for me, that has been a bad example of how science and society interact. So I think science has a key role to play to inform policymakers, but I'm also, and there I have unfortunately no answer to, I'm also thinking policymakers and the general public also maybe need to become a bit more science literate again. And that could be an issue of maybe education, how we raise our kids to be open to science and to deal with science. I think it also has to do with the speed of how information spreads these days, and that there's often in a social media age no time to actually think about science, to read a long paper instead of 140 no, it's not even letters, a tweet. I'm not on Twitter, sorry, so I wouldn't know. So I think it's a question of everyone coming together, and whether we are, as a society, willing to do that. I do have my doubts these days. But on the other hand, if we think about how a counterfactual would look like, how a society would look like in which we don't believe in science, in which we don't take into consideration the warnings and the signs that we get from science, I think then we would be entirely doomed. Sorry, not very optimistic.
Yeah, you know, when you close a sentence with "we are entirely doomed," yeah, maybe not too optimistic, right? And also just just to help you there, Suzanne. Twitter is now called X, apparently. So there you go. TEBALDO, I'd like to quickly jump back to you, just to see if you have a response with regards to what Suzanne was saying, and with regards to the role that science is playing. I mean, for the first time, obviously, we're seeing the science taking a major role within, should we say, some of the communications that are coming out from the Holy See. So what role do you see science playing within the Vatican and moving these people, as we were mentioning before?
Academy of Sciences has been established centuries ago within the Vatican, especially in the field of, let's say, exact sciences, medicine, physics, and chiefly astronomy. So the work of the Holy See diplomacy and of the Pope has been very, very, very frequently illuminated, inspired, and informed by scientific knowledge. And I may add that a lot of Catholic vision or whatever. And in many, many universities, there are a lot of collaborations precisely to make science, including social sciences, available in the easiest way. I have also in mind many UNESCO-related projects. So Suzanne just mentioned this problem between science and policy decision, policy making, and science and, let's say, people, ordinary people, not necessarily scientists. What about trust? What about confidence? What about skepticism and fake news? These are certainly major, major problems. It is not because the Pope says or publishes one more contribution quoting scientific data, then this will certainly change much perception or the overall decisions. Still, I think there is some consistency, since the Holy See, in the name of the Vatican State, also presented a few months ago its own NDC, National Determined Contribution, in the field of climate change mitigation, insisting a lot also on education and CO2 emission reduction. So it's always a mix between telling and being consistent with what you do. Maybe we would like to have more governments being consistent between what they know, because their scientists and advisors already rang the bell many, many years ago, and the laws and what they propose. Only a few weeks ago, strong articles have been released about the changes in Atlantic currents in the ocean. This may have massive impacts in Europe. This is a warning from science. What will do governance? This is a brief answer. Over for the moment, but thank you.
Perfect, TEBALDO. I was going to jump straight to Johan, but he put his hand up to add to that. So I'll pass directly over to you, Johan.
It's really interesting to listen to this discussion, particularly Suzanne and TEBALDO, on the role of science and scientists. I think many scientists have been sort of used to, we do good science, we put results out there, and we expect policymakers to make use of this best science and make wise decisions on this scientific basis. And what we seem to see now is scientists, particularly in the climate sphere, becoming increasingly desperate and frustrated because action is clearly not being taken. And you see scientists sort of stepping out of their fairly passive role in producing and delivering scientific results and trying now increasingly to influence policymakers. You find them on the streets, you find them making much more noise than we have been used to. Would anyone of you like to comment on that? And then if David had another question for me, I'd be happy to come back to that. But this personal, the sense of personal responsibility, I do care, and I know what is going to happen. I do not see the action taken. While we were speaking, I just received here a push notice saying that GHG gases are now at record levels again. News out this morning. So would you like to comment on that, the personal responsibility and role of scientists?
Thank you, Johan. I think your questions are fantastic, and I would prefer just to, at the moment, provide a little bit of space for Diego, that he had his hand up, and then we can come back to your intervention.
Yes, thank you. I just want to mention one thing is that I have a very strange role because I happen to be an academic, but I'm also a policy practitioner. I work in the tracks of long-term engagements, but also the one-page memo in which you have to reduce the world for the decision makers. And the issue is that we are lacking a compelling narrative to connect the science and the policymakers. We don't have something that allows them, the policymakers, the cover to engage on something that will help them withstand the ups and downs of the environment, of the electoral and the political game. And one of the things I have found in my work is that from science to policy, it takes too long. It's not translated fast enough. It's not transformed and adapted to the elements in which you really need to have some action. I mean, every time I ask a colleague, an academic, A or B, they say it depends, and it takes a long time, and there's a lot of many caveats. And when I'm dealing with a policymaker, they need a binary, yes, no, give me 3 options. This is the talking points I need to use. So we need to be able to create that. And there are elements in terms of the narrative that need to be improved. One, I have the feeling that this is related to what we all discussing here. I mentioned before, we need to have an improvement in the institutional mechanisms that are there to negotiate, coordinate, and ensure that we have a unified and a more effective action to deal with the problem. Second, we need to be inclusive of intergenerational equity and elements that are not part of the discourse. You know, everything in diplomacy today reflects the idea in which different states get to talk to each other, and by achieving some sort of a amalgamation of interests, we achieve either a common denominator. It can be the maximum common denominator, or it can be the minimum common denominator. That is great when we're dealing with strategic staff and, you know, Kissinger and that kind of stuff. That doesn't work when we need to have an integrated action to fundamentally change the way human society works. And so that is needed. And I don't think anything in terms of the discourse, in terms of the institutional mandates or the political mandates, are leading us in that situation. That needs to be put on the table. And the third element is that I have the feeling, and this is someone who was dealing with politicians and policymakers, at the end of the day, the whole complexity of the world has to be reduced to, I wouldn't say slogans, but compelling concepts, something that sticks with you. You know, yes, we can, or democracy now, or change is possible, that kind of thing. Because otherwise you don't mobilize people, and mobilization is essential. Social mobilization is essential. So what is the concept? And what is the justification for an integrated action? How can we just go back to COP28 and have this slogan that is going to get everybody on the same page? It is a challenge. I work a lot with someone who has been trying to integrate the idea of human dignity as a fundamental concept behind and underneath everything in terms of international governance. And, you know, people will say, yeah, of course, human dignity. Well, not really. It's not part of the system. And if somebody asked me today, why should we do something about it? Why should we change? I would say, because we should have a fundamental respect for human dignity, and therefore every action is necessary and every effort should be spent. But it's not happening yet.
Thanks, Diego. I think I think it would be difficult to disagree with this idea that every human needs to be respected. Unfortunately, global situations at the moment are showing the opposite. So let's see if we can get that dramatic change that you're talking about, specifically when we're looking at fundamental changes regards to climate that we need to be looking at. And Johan, this is where I wanted to jump into you. When we start looking at these fundamental changes, of course, TEBALDO was talking about this idea of why should I care, right? And how do we move that? And we were having this debate with regards to science and behavioral changes, and how that can influence the greater public in terms of moving towards a better future with regards to climate action. One of the aspects that you mentioned in your presentations was around the idea of political tools. And so I'd like to just jump into that a little bit, because we've mentioned a few examples of different types of political tools that can be used to at least drive the community in this idea of why they should care. But what, from your perspective, would be the different types of political tools that perhaps we could look at in terms of creating this dramatic change that we need?
That is a big and very difficult question, I think, because you're asking for something that we obviously have not yet seen, since we do not see the progress that is needed. I think, well, it's probably a combination of things. And I think the stating our common humanity and the way that Diego talks about this and the dignity of the human person, I think there are common values that are shared between religions and between cultures and so on. And to the extent that these can be evoked and communicated in such a way that they touch people, clearly that's important. Another much more kind of crude and concrete aspect is if you start to sense that you yourself are being impacted. And I think what Susanne mentioned about how long do people remember having been affected by a natural disaster, and realizing that this may happen again if not policy change does happen. And the thing now, obviously, is that we are seeing people are experiencing things that they have never before expected. We see extreme weather occurring at times and in places that we have not seen before. And I was curious also when listening to Diego talk about how is the climate that makes changes in policy, sort of how does that mature into actually triggering real change? You need 25% of the population, or is it something else? And it would be interesting, I think, to see what has, for example, the communities around the Mediterranean that have been so seriously affected by fires, forest fires over these past years, and now can expect these really lethal fires occurring every summer. We see some of these very dramatic flooding in Europe during the past summers and so on. We recently had a storm in Sweden which affected some of the most affluent communities in southern Sweden that have their houses, along the beach. And the beach was so seriously undermined that the houses started to really, started to collapse. And these were communities that had resisted the notion of actually building dikes or protective barriers and so on as sea level rise happens. So that's also obviously an issue to look at. How can you help communities understand that what they have experienced in terms of extreme events is actually part of a pattern that is going to become stronger? How could you use that? How could you communicate that in a constructive way, which would enable and help policymakers make the necessary decisions? So as you hear, I have no I have no silver bullet in terms of inventing political tools, but clearly we have not yet been able to do what is necessary.
Exactly, and I think finding that silver bullet will maybe take some time and collaboration, right, across different perspectives, different scales, multiple stakeholders, and of course different countries and perspectives and ideas. Actually, Johan, and I'll come to you now, TEBALDO, that you've raised your hand. Johan, just to follow up a little bit about what you were mentioning about this idea of beaches being washed away through extreme storms. This happened in South Africa, in close to where I was born. There was a beach there that we used to frequent as youngsters, and basically grew up around there. And an extreme storm completely washed away this beach that now no longer exists. And so you start to look at this idea of, well, my childhood memories are being washed away with these violent storms, and so there's an emotional attachment as well to these extreme events that maybe isn't so keenly looked into, and indeed that can start to move people, right? This idea of this emotional attachment to these particular aspects. But TEBALDO, you had an intervention or a comment, so I'll come to you.
Thank you very much. Two brief ideas. The first one, well, earlier I mentioned the rule of law, which is so important. Governance, institutions, indicators, understanding if you are delivering or not, etc. I will refrain from going deeper inside game theory, also because this is not, frankly, my field of expertise in economics. Still, very often reciprocity is studied. A does, then B does, hoping that, you see what I mean, reciprocity. But also both in economics and social sciences, we study non-reciprocal agents. That's it. I am committing, not knowing if the others will do the same. I will refrain from polluting, not knowing if other companies, my competitors, will do the same. I will reduce my CO2 emissions, not knowing if the others will. I will adapt and adopt expensive technologies, maybe more sophisticated and cleaner fuels, not knowing if the others will do the same. Why should I care is not so obvious in these circumstances. Why some actors are taking that risk? Of course, there is the hope that some virtuous circle will start and others will start also adopting the same, maybe more noble or more sustainable rules. And in the long term, we may even have some thing related to, I beg your pardon, something related to governance and new rules. But often we need some pioneers to lead the way, to show a direction, an example. And obviously they will also need science, but all the sciences. The second point was, again, this strong economic interest. Well, I think it's not top secret information that some previous COP have not been so ambitious, at least in their final declarations, also because of strong economic interests. Only now, in a very tepid and cautious way, we are addressing fossil fuel, for example, very, very slowly. So there are strong interests. Now we are discussing a lot about collecting data, artificial intelligence, and that kind of, well, quantum science, whatever. So remember, please, some 60, 70 years ago, the atomic bomb disrupted geopolitics, governance, and science. And at that time, the nuclear research, the scientific research, was in the hands of governments. That is someone or something that more or less is in charge of the public interest of the common good. Now, 60 years after, in whose hands is science? What is the percent of science owned, financed, and let's say scheduled by governments or by the EU, and the percentage of scientific budget organized, financed by big private interests? This will also be a strong question.
Thank you, TEBALDO. I think that that last question definitely resonates quite strongly. I think this idea of whose hands science is. Actually had a separate question for Suzanne, but I think this one is quite interesting. So maybe I jump directly to you, Suzanne, with regards to whose hands science is in. Because for me, I would like to think that science is in our own hands, right? And so in terms of research and pure research, these ideas come from ourselves and not guided by any larger organization or institution. What is your opinion on that, Suzanne?
Yeah, tricky question. I would be totally with you. I think, or I would wish to think that science comes out of science, but at the same time, of course, we all know that science is not there for the pure ivory tower research only, but actually also has the ambition. We all have the ambition to actually respond to societal, to environmental, political challenges. So of course, what we do is driven to some extent by forces outside of science. I think the question is more, how do we deal with those? Are we aware how questions emerge? Are we aware of how we deal with questions? Are we able, and there you get into the whole debate about how science is funded, are governments funding science properly and so on, but are we in a position as scientists to do proper research, to come up with the best answers we can, even if maybe the question that is being addressed to us comes from someone that might have a particular interest one way or the other? And I would want to relate that a little bit to what Diego said earlier about, I made a little note about dumbing down science. Diego put it much more nicely and more diplomatically in terms of finding slogans and being able to express it in let's say a way that can be taken up by everyone. But I think that's a fine line that we're walking, because yes, I agree with Diego saying that science needs to communicate to policymakers, to society, to use, to anyone basically in a very audience-specific way, and make sure that the messages that we have are not too complicated to not necessarily taken up, but at least understood and processed. But at the same time, I think this is a bit a thin line to walk, because we also want society to be educated, to be interested. So often as scientists, we're also teachers. So that's also a role that we have, where we want to educate anyone from like small kids to university students to basically everyone in terms of lifelong learning, and incentivize people to think in more complex ways. Because I don't think that the challenges that we're facing today in the poly crisis are something that can necessarily be broken down into one sentence. So I think, yes, we have a responsibility as scientists to formulate and to communicate things in a way that is easily understood, but we also have at the same time the responsibility in our more educational function to make sure that we equip everyone with the ability to understand science. So that was maybe kind of a side note to Diego, and I see that he raised his hand, so it seems that he wants to respond to it.
May I say something to that? Yes, I agree with you. I mean, we need to educate, and we need to be able to ensure that as many as possible are going to be able to act and behave, because science indicates that that's the path to follow. But now, putting my policymaker, politician hat, have to be pragmatic. And I don't know if we can mobilize people with reason to the extent that is needed. In some cases, we need to mobilize with something else. We need to go for the guts. We need to go for something that gets people moving. And I'm just thinking of these two things. And for some reason, I always remember this famous phrase of Winston Churchill: we fight in the water, we fight here, we fight there, and we will really prevail. And that was able to transcend as a mobilizer, regardless of what level of complexity you had in terms of the situation at the moment. And we also have to remember that in the mechanisms, the institutional frameworks that we have today, we have 200 million people in the US having an inordinate amount of power in terms of determining how the world is going to happen, how the world is going to shape in next year. It might be going one way or the other. We don't have something that ensures equal representation to everybody. Ideally, we should. We don't. So within those parameters, how can we ensure that we have the argument for those who want to listen, the arguments for those who want to reason, and the arguments for those who have absolutely no understanding of the matter, but that can capture somehow the imperatives that are at play here? Because I see it in my interactions with my fellow Canadians. Not everybody understands what's at play. Some people want to still have the house, the big loan, the truck, and they live in a different world with the energy consumption is off the roof. How can I just make sure that that person, where she is, where he is still going to be part of the solution, because he or she still holds the vote that is the one unit of consensus building that we need in our system. So pragmatically, I'm with you. We shouldn't dumb it down to the point in which we dilute the science, but we need to be able to translate it to the point in which it goes equally well for the diplomats, the scientists, and the people on the street that don't necessarily follow the issue every day, but which we need them in order to be able to maintain the policy direction that we need to have.
And
we agree that we have to go for the gut, but keep on educating the brain.
I agree, 100%.
In fact, I would actually add something to this, and maybe this is more to the point, is that we need to generate trust in science. And I think that this is maybe something that is lacking not only at the highest levels, but also at more the community level, where, and I think you mentioned it right at the start, Cassandra, is that this idea of false news and that sort of thing that comes out where real scientific breakthroughs and advances, and we look at the vaccines for COVID, for example, science was directly behind that, right? But there's this real concern from a large portion of society with regards to trust in the results, trust in what is being told to people, right? And so this is the idea that we as professionals in this area, we can work with. And potentially with this, TEBALDO, I'd like to come to you with regards to the role that you're having. You're looking at both the science side of things and also dealing with, you've mentioned this idea of creating different arguments for people to listen to, etc. So how do you think that trust within scientific results can help to create better diplomacy?
Certainly the question, why should I care, is not the same as, let's say, why should I care as a household? Why should I care as a major or senator? Why should I care as the CEO of a big company or as a chief of state? Different levels of responsibility, different levels of knowledge, of awareness, and of choice, of course. So each one may have its own relation, necessary, needed relation with science. The encyclical letter Laudato Si last chapter, chapter number 6 of Laudato Si, finishes with 3 pillars, which are spirituality, culture, and education. Science, and all science, I mean, social sciences, humanities, physics, mathematics, whatever, have a lot to do with those 3 pillars, chiefly with education. So maybe trust can come through that channel of education. But do not forget the 2 others, which may go beyond science and maybe bridge some gaps, which are culture and spiritual values. I'd like also to think that human dignity, as mentioned by a previous speaker, can be a universal value, a concern for everybody. I'm afraid it is not like that. Maybe a few governments, I'm afraid, are not ready to fight for human dignity and the sustainable life for human beings inside a sustainable planet. How can we convince even those governments to have a healthy diplomacy? So maybe this will be my last words. Certainly, having all aligned around strong values, but also being able to reconcile those strong economic interests. Otherwise, they may hijack the diplomacy we need. So what values, what economic system, and what post-GDP discussion we have for the future we want?
Thank you, TEBALDO. I think you've raised some interesting points there, and there's a question from the audience actually that kind of follows on from what you were mentioning there, where it was from Lesha Whitmer, that from the Women for Water Partnership, says in her question, 30% is the tipping point to get real behavioral change. I think, Diego, you mentioned something around 25, 30. We're not going to split hairs. Basically, she's mentioning that science is not reaching the majority of people, basically not understood in terms of jargon, languages, or types of communication channels. And her question really goes along the lines of, do we need communication experts to help within this? Do we need more slogans? But, well, maybe she's saying we don't need more slogans, but more accessible information. And it's a bit complicated to get clear explanations and examples. And so her question goes along the lines of, do we need to teach academics on this type of communication and this way of speaking? And do we need more initiatives like social engagement platforms? So maybe we haven't heard from you in a bit, Johan, so maybe we can jump directly to you to get your reaction on this question. Oh, you're muted.
I think this is a question that we hear repeated quite frequently. There is this sense of, we talked about the gap between science and policy, and we talked about, and we often come back to the issue of the inability of scientists to communicate clearly with the public, to help create the kind of consensus and agreement among the public to actually look for, to demand policy change. So this is it's a long-standing issue. I think the problem now is partly that we see policy being made not only not being based on the best possible science, but deliberately and knowingly developing policy ignoring the evidence. We see it in the sense of, we see much of climate-related policies, or policies that influence greenhouse gas emissions and so on. We see it. We haven't come to that issue that we could have discussed today about migration. I think we see lots of policies on migration being based not at all on evidence, but on ideology and on perception of the other that's being used in the domestic political discourse, xenophobic discourse, which sort of ignores what we actually do know about the way migration is being part of social transformation and has always been. And we also see it to some extent, I think, in policies coming to grips with increasing criminality and gang and violence and so on, which tends to be almost exclusively repressive, not investing in the kind of preparedness, preventive measures that are also needed. So I don't have an answer, but I think we are in a serious spot, because not only because science is not being communicated, but it's deliberately being undermined by policies that are not based on evidence. So this is a very serious issue, and we need to really understand what is at play here, how does it work, and what could be done that has not yet been done in terms of addressing it.
Yeah, thank you, Johan. And with that, I think we'll just have to wrap up. I think we've come to the end of our time here. So I would just like to thank profusely our esteemed panel. The discussions that we were having here could have gone well into the night, or indeed into your day. and I think we've well, I could totally see myself sitting down and sharing a drink, a glass of wine, a couple of beers, and chatting more around these subjects. But just to try and wrap up a little bit, I see we having a real discussion around the subject of why should I care in terms of the climate change and what that means for me as a person, where that relates directly to changes in diplomacy that we can have, because not only is it from an individual behavioral point of view, but then we also have the role of science in diplomacy and how that role can change with regards to how it is communicated and how governments actually take up the information that is provided by science, and whether there is indeed trust in these results, and whether that communication about these results is correct and is reaching the population in the way and the format that the population can create these behavioral changes. And Diego had mentioned that we got 25% more or less to see the tipping point for change to happen. So if we can communicate and we can generate that trust in science, we can start to get the types of diplomacy, the types of policies that we need in order to create that change. And this can come about through what Diego was mentioning on these ideas of compelling concepts, right? Or Suzanne was mentioning the idea of maybe dumbing down a little bit, but essentially we looking at the way that we communicate and the way that we are generating trust within this entire system, and that we can have a plurality of voices that can start to create the change that we want to see, and to make sure that we are looking forward to a just and equitable world in where we can really start to overcome these challenges to climate change. So with that, thank you so much to all of you. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. So that has been down to your inputs and your perspectives. So thank you for that. And with that, we'll hand back to the coordinators.
Thank you all. Cheers.
Thank you.